In the course of our story, we shall see that James was by no means singular in this absurd style of reasoning. In 1604, scarcely more than a year after he had become King of England, Parliament passed the famous Witch Act, which remained on the statute book until the reign of George II. It was in the reign of Charles I that trials and executions under the Witch Act were the most frequent. While the Long Parliament was in session, the affair attained almost the proportions of an epidemic. But under the rule of Cromwell, there was a sudden halt, and thereafter the delusion never fully recovered its hold upon the community. Cases like those of Amy Duny and Rose Cullender were sporadic. In that age of Newton and Locke, the whole baleful troop of demons were spreading their wings for their final flight from this world. The last executions for witchcraft, however, occurred in England in 1712 and in Scotland in 1722. We may observe in passing that in Germany, the case of Maria Renata, a nun beheaded for witchcraft, occurred as late as 1749, the year in which Goethe was born. Considering the fact that the exodus of the Puritans to New England occurred during the reign of Charles I, while the prosecutions for witchcraft were increasing towards a maximum in the mother country, it is rather strange that so few cases occurred in the New World. It was already noted in Cromwell's time that the independency in ecclesiastical matters seemed to be attended by a diminution of activity in the world of witches. But on the other hand, the independents who came over to New England voluntarily thrust themselves into a country which was supposed to be in a special sense under the direct control and administration of the devil. It was believed that pagan countries generally were ruled by Satan, and that here in the American wilderness, that old foe of mankind had taken his stand to annoy and dishearten the Lord's elect. As for the red men, it was easy to see that they were his veritable imps. Their tricks and manners proclaimed them as such. There could be little doubt that the heathen New World was Satan's kingdom, and in view of this very common belief, it is strange that the instances of witchcraft or diabolism were so rare in the early history of New England. During the 60 years following the first settlement of Boston, a dozen or more cases can be enumerated. The first victim in the New World was Margaret Jones of Charlestown, who had some sensible ideas about medicine. She disapproved of wholesale bleeding and violent emetics, and used to work cures by means of herb tonics and other simple prescriptions. This offended the doctors, and in 1648, the poor woman was tried for witchcraft, convicted, and hanged. Governor Winthrop, who tells the story, adds that at the very hour of her execution, there was a great gale in Connecticut, which blew down trees, and this he considers an absolute demonstration of her guilt. When Winthrop wrote this, Isaac Newton was a child playing in the nursery. When we see a mind so broad and cultivated as Winthrop's, entertaining such notions of cause and effect, is it not obvious that the mainstay and support of the frightful superstition was ignorance of physical science? About the same time, according to Thomas Hutchinson, a woman was hanged at Dorchester and another at Cambridge for the crime of witchcraft. The next case was a startling one on the account of the victim's social position. A woman like Margaret Jones, though perhaps educated, and such as would today be classed a lady, was in those times not called Mrs. Jones, but simply Goodwife or Goody Jones. To be Mrs. or Mistress one must be the wife of an esquire, and the rank of esquire was as carefully guarded in common forms of speech as the rank of knight or baronet. The next victim of the witch delusion was Mistress Anne Hibbins. Her husband, William Hibbins, who died in 1654, had been for 12 years a member of the Council of Assistants, and at one time was the colony's diplomatic agent in England. Her brother, Richard Bellingham, was a deputy governor of Massachusetts. In 1656, this lady was tried for witchcraft before Governor Endicott and the General Court. She was found guilty and was hanged on Boston Common on the 19th of June of that year. The verdict and death warrant are in the colonial records, but we have no report of the case and do not know how the accusation was originated. Hutcheson, whose great-grandfather Edward was one of the lady's friends, believed it to be a case of outrageous persecution, and so some of her contemporaries regarded it. The Reverend John Norton, persecutor of Quakers, was by temperament quick to see marks of Satan's presence, but he tried his best to save Mrs. Hibbins, and afterwards spoke of her accusers with his customary sarcasm. Mrs. Hibbins was hanged, he said, only for having more wit than her neighbors. One day she saw two persons whom she knew to be unfriendly to her talking together in the street, whereupon she exclaimed that she knew they were talking about her. Her guess being correct, was forthwith cited against her as an instance of supernatural insight, which must have been imparted to her by the devil. According to Norton, this argument had great weight with the court. It is a pity, and it is strange too, that we know so little of this case, for there must have been something extraordinary in the circumstances that could thus send to the gallows one of the foremost persons in that colonial society. There is evidence that the affair created fierce excitement and left much bitterness behind. There were many in Boston who insisted that a saint had been wickedly done to death by slanderous tongues. Out of a dozen cases in the course of the next 30 years, we find several acquittals, and once in a while we encounter a gleam of genuine common sense, as in the case of John Bradstreet of Rowley, who was accused of familiarity with the devil, for as much as the said Bradstreet confessed that he had read in a book of magic, and that he heard a voice asking him what work he had for him. He answered, "Go make a bridge of sand over the sea, go make a ladder of sand up to heaven, and go to God, and come down no more." When the case was tried at Ipswich, the jury found that the said Bradstreet lied, whereupon the court sentenced him to pay 20 shillings fine, or else to be whipped. More disastrous was the case of the Goodwin children in Boston in 1688. An Irish Catholic woman named Glover was laundress for John Goodwin's family, in which there were 4 children. One day the eldest child, Martha, aged 13, accused the Glover woman of purloining some pieces of linen. Glover answered with threats and curses, and Martha presently fell down in a fit. The other children, aged 11, 7, and 5, soon followed her example. Then they went through with all sorts of pranks. They would pretend to be deaf and dumb. They would complain of being pricked with pins or cut with knives. They would bark like dogs and purr like cats. They even performed feats of what modern spirit rappers call levitation, skimming over the ground without appearing to touch it, seeming, as Cotton Mather said, to fly like geese. This sort of thing went on for several weeks. Doctors and ministers agreed that the children must have been bewitched by the Glover woman, and she was accordingly hanged. The chief interest in this case arises from Cotton Mather's connection with it. That famous divine son of Increase Mather and grandson of John Cotton was then 5 and 20 years of age. He had been graduated at Harvard 10 years before. His career as an author had already begun, and he was already regarded as the most learned man of his time. The range of his reading was enormous. Theology, philosophy, history, literature, physical science, in all these he was omnivorous, and he could write and speak at least 7 languages, one of them the Iroquois, with fluency and precision. In the course of his life, he published nearly 400 books and tracts, most of which bring in a high price now, while some are indispensable to the student of history. He was an earnest and severely conscientious man. His chief foible was vanity, which was perhaps not strange in view of the wholesale homage and adulation to which he was accustomed. He was not a profound or original thinker, nor was he free from the errors and superstitions characteristic of his time. But in most matters his face was set toward the future, and his work was helpful to mankind. In 1721, in spite of furious opposition and some personal peril, he succeeded in introducing into America inoculation for smallpox, the most conspicuous among many instances in which he showed himself wiser than his contemporaries. With his other fine qualities, he was a man of loving heart and gracious sympathies. But, in the disputes and conflicts of his time, he took too prominent a part to get along without making enemies. And so it happened that after the witchcraft delusion had become thoroughly discredited, a malicious writer saw fit to distort and misrepresent his relations to it. The slanders of Robert Califf became the commonplaces of historical writers in a later generation, and the memory of Cotton Mather has been held up to scorn as that of a man who did more than anyone else to stimulate and foster the witchcraft delusion in Massachusetts. This view is maintained by Charles Wentworth Upham in his History of the Salem Witchcraft, published in 1867 in 2 volumes, the most learned and elaborate work on the subject. It was repeated at second hand from older writers and embellished with cheap rhetoric by George Bancroft, and has usually been copied by the makers of compendiums and school books, so that it has obtained a firm lodgment in the popular mind. The correct view of Cotton Mather's relations to witchcraft was first set forth in Longfellow's New England Tragedies, published in 1868. The poet had studied the original documents with profound attention, and his fine critical insight had detected the truth when Upham, the dry-as-dust specialist, had missed it. But the first full and adequate statement of the case was made in 1869 by the late William Frederick Poole, who was at that time librarian of the Boston Athenaeum. Cultivation of the critical faculty and the exercise of it upon original sources of information are perpetually obliging us to modify, and sometimes to reverse, long accepted judgments upon historical characters and events. In the present brief narrative, I shall simply indicate, without controversy, the true position of Cotton Mather.